Let's now move on to the 10-mark question. So this is an assess question. Assess whether firms in the electronics industry benefit from economies of scale. I would personally, of course, say yes, since why? In this electronics industry, these are large firms, and when large firms increase their output, what happens? What is the actual definition of economies of scale? It's when output increases, costs fall, or when output increases, long run average costs fall. And that is, of course, and let's see this on the diagram. Output is increasing, and what is happening to costs? Costs are also decreasing. What are some of the reasons for this? In the live classes, I emphasize these two specific economies of scale, since they're the ones, in my experience, where students pick up the most marks, since they can write the most depth analysis about them. So firstly, purchasing, and then technical. So how do firms in the electronics industry benefit from purchasing economies of scale? So earlier on, we were looking at computer chips. So of course, computer chips, they could buy these computer chips in bulk, and we're buying in bulk by having a larger size of the order. What does that mean? It means it increases their bargaining power. Therefore, with this increased bargaining power, they're able to negotiate lower cost per unit. And when they lower their cost per unit, that means their longer run average cost falls. Thus, they are able to exploit these economies of scale. And the same thing with technical economies of scale. So technical economies of scale is where firms invest into specialist capital. And with regards to technical economies of scale, of course, 10-mark question, you are going to need some application. So of course, you can talk about the investment into artificial intelligence, into robots. So this is, of course, research and development. This is innovation. And if I just scan these two extracts as well, towards the end, this does mention the keyword of economies of scale, and then it says are able to finance high risk innovation. So that would, of course, be technical economies of scale. Then it also talks about global advertising, which would be classed as marketing economies of scale. So I've just written up this point, the purchasing economies of scale point, just show you guys how I'd write it. So purchasing economies of scale, like I said, computer chips, large size of order, bargaining power, reduce cost per unit, reducing LRAC, which allows them to exploit their economy of scale, move towards that minimum efficient scale point, which is the lowest point on the LRAC. But then how can I evaluate this, since of course in this 12-mark question, and of course just talking about computer chips there, you can maybe talk about the prices, anything like that, that would be application. But how could I evaluate here, since of course in the extract, what we're talking about with computer chips, we're talking about the price of computer chips increasing. So that kind of goes against what we're saying here. So the way I'd evaluate is, however, despite exploiting economies of scale, supply chain issues cause computer chips to be more expensive, thus reducing the degree to which the costs are reduced. So essentially, we're doing our best to exploit economies of scale and reduce our prices, but the problem with the supply chains, which is outside our control, is basically massively increasing prices. So it's a really good and a really well thought out evaluation point. And of course here you could also evaluate with diseconomies of scale. The best evaluation point for economies of scale is always going to be diseconomies of scale, but I've chosen to reserve that for my second paragraph point. Okay, so with regards to the second paragraph with technical economy of scale, we just have added a bit more detail here. So of course, application marks there. But when firms invest into specialist capital, what is the main thing it improves? It improves a firm's firstly efficiency and then productivity. But productivity is such a simple word you learn really early on in economics in about year 12. But a lot of students forget what the actual meaning of productivity is. Productivity is output per unit time. And if there's one thing you take from this entire paper, just make sure you remember that. Output per unit time is productivity. Thus, if productivity increases, it means more output per unit time. Thus, if you think about a worker, if a firm needs a worker to produce 30 units a day, and now the worker is more productive, instead of spending 8 hours to produce those 30 units, maybe he only needs 6 hours. Therefore, why does this reduce a firm's costs? Since now they only need to hire him for 6 hours, so they need to hire him for 2 less hours, pay 2 less hours of wages, etc. So that is why it reduces the longer average cost. So like I've said here, the specialist capital will lead to an increase in productivity and quality, thus more output per unit time, and a decrease in long run average cost. And then, of course, for your 10-mark question, you do need some evaluation. So how have I worded that? It's a point which we mentioned in the last paragraph, which is about diseconomies of scale. So what are diseconomies of scale? Well, the three main types of diseconomies of scale, the way I tell students to remember it is A, B, C, alienation, bureaucracy, and communication. Here I've gone into depth with the alienation, which is essentially when workers lose motivation, and when they lose motivation, essentially their productivity falls, the output falls, therefore the output falls is the inverse of an increase in productivity, of course, which leads to higher costs for firms since they have to work for longer for the same output. And of course you can represent that on the diagram using this section of the diagram where costs are, so as output increases, costs are also increasing. And of course you can use the other diseconomies of scale like bureaucracy, a great example of course the NHS, managers of managers, there's managers of managers, so lots of bureaucracy in the NHS wastes hundreds of millions a year. But yeah, there's also different examples here. We'll just go into any single example and prove why it increases the costs. But yeah, that is how I would, to wrap it up, how I would answer the 10 mark question.